Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Azure MythBusters. I'm Glen from the FastTrack for Azure team.
And I'm Chris Reddington, also from the FastTrack for Azure team.
And in this episode, we're going to look at the magical management capabilities of Azure. So Chris, when we put anything in Azure, when we move anything to the cloud, we don't really have to worry about what happens in there, do we? Azure just takes care of it for us.
Like any good consulting answer, it depends. So this is one of the things that we hear quite a lot. You know, it's okay, we can just let the cloud vendor go and manage everything for us. Now, something we've talked about previously is requirements.
Yes.
And that answer really depends on what your requirements are. So whether you want to go and completely remove all of that management overhead or whether you want more control is one of those things that depends on, and it depends on what you want. So it can be true as a thought. So let's just recap a slide that I think a lot of people have probably seen at some point if they're moving to the cloud.
What are the different parts of Azure?
Absolutely.
Yes.
So when we think about on-premises, that full stack is something that you go and control.
Yes.
If you think about the different elements of cloud that you can go and manage and go and take, there are three main models that you think of. So infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. So the extreme end of the spectrum is something like Office 365, where you don't really see under the covers, you don't really care, you just consume it.
Yes.
And then there are these things in the middle, infrastructure and platform as a service. And that infrastructure piece is where you control some more of that management. And the platform as a service is where it may be a little more grey, because there are different elements of how much control you could or maybe don't want to have as well.
Yes.
So let's just jump in and think of a few different pieces that are important to consider.
The scalability is one that often comes up with this. Azure will just do it for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we hear that a lot of times.
We do.
And I understand why there's that thought, because a lot of people typically think of things like serverless, things like PaaS, but it is important to recognize on a service by service basis that might be different.
Absolutely.
But before we jump into any of those, let's just think of two really important concepts to consider here. So scaling out versus scaling up. So this idea of scalability is really something which is important in the cloud, because you've got this new access to infrastructure. You've got this pool of infrastructure that you can go and call upon. It's probably a luxury we didn't have in an on-premises world so
Very
much.
much so.
So these concepts may be new to a few people.
Yeah.
So scaling out is the idea that you add more instances to go and serve a workload. So let's assume we're getting a large volume of requests from our web application. Or maybe we've got a queue of messages that need to be processed for some job, for example. The way that you could do that, there are various design patterns, again, on the Azure Architecture Center, things like competing consumer, a number of other patterns there as well, where you can go and use those multiple instances to go and deal with that load, for example.
Yes.
So that's a way of kind of fanning out, if you like, and getting more instances to deal with that workload that's coming in. And that works pretty well if you've got things where they're stateless workloads and not necessarily stateful, where you need to rely on what's going on one instance or another.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't always work. Maybe, for example, you're using a specific vendor product, maybe a specific application where it needs to have a single instance, for example. And there are cases where there are reasons where you want to go.
Absolutely. It's maybe an older application. It's not been designed with scale out in mind.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the way to deal with that would be scaling up. So rather than adding more instances to deal with that load, you make that box bigger effectively. So rather than 1 gigabyte of RAM, 1 CPU, you make it 4 gigabytes of RAM and 4 CPU, for example, instead. Yes. So that's the difference between scaling out and scaling up. One of the things you do need to be careful of sometimes, though, with a scaling up approach is that if you have a workload running and you haven't got any resilience there, then what typically happens is as you scale up, it needs to move to a different underlying host machine.
Yes.
So the reason then you'll see some downtime is because it's actually migrating the workload somewhere else.
Absolutely. And to be clear, when we're talking about scaling up and scaling out, you can do both at the same time as well, can't you?
Absolutely. And there's no reason why you couldn't redeploy and do those tests up front, because all of these things, when we talk about with scalability, are not finger in the air, maybe this will work or this will work. This is where things like DevOps come into play, where you need to have your load tests and all of your thorough automation in there to go and create these environments, tear them down, test, rinse, try again.
Absolutely.
So bringing it back onto the scaling side of things, I've got a few examples here on screen of different approaches that you could take. So if we start with the very common example there, which is virtual machines.
Yes.
A virtual machine, I think, is a common known element. You know, we've had those on-prem a number of years now. Exactly.
Yes.
So the thing to consider about virtual machines, though, is that you need to deal with the scalability. So there are a few different concepts we'll come to about resilience on the next slides here, but you need to actually go and add the individual virtual machines. Azure won't necessarily do that for you out of the box. There are ways you can, of course, automate that, but you need to deal with that. Now, comparing that to something like virtual machine scale sets is where, you know, those virtual machines, rather than them being individual objects, the virtual machine scale set is just a vanilla kind of set of machines, and then it's just a bit like a slider or an auto scale rule where you just go, I want to have this many machines between this boundaries, and I can, you know, define how you want those to scale up, whether it's on certain metrics, for example.
The important piece there, as you said there, is you still have to define it. Azure's not going to make those decisions for you just because you've put a virtual machine in there. You have to specify what those boundaries are, what the rules are.
Exactly. And that's very similar for app services as well. So even as we start moving from infrastructure into PaaS, that's still the same case. Where it gets a bit grayer is something like Azure Functions. And, you know, Azure Functions are great because it's serverless, it's this new world where we're kind of working, we don't need to think about any of that underlying infrastructure, but there are still things that you do need to think about. Like, for example, do you go for a consumption plan or do you go for a more traditional app service plan? And that consumption plan is really good because it deals with all of that behind the scenes for you. You just pay per invocation and you don't worry about the setup or anything, it just goes and deals with that. But again, certain workloads might tailor themselves to that, other workloads might not.
Absolutely. Comes back to requirements, comes back to design and test.
Exactly. So that's kind of the scaling side, that's the auto scale side. Now, you know, of course, these align to requirements, and it would be wrong of us not to talk about something like resilience as well. With all of these
important,
different areas. And there's a couple of concepts that it's really worth us just talking about. So on the slide we say resilience in IaaS, but it really does apply across all of the Azure services.
Resilience is global, yeah.
Absolutely. So the two main ways you can think about that in Azure today are things like availability sets and availability zones. So on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got availability sets. And this idea is a logical construct, and you just put your virtual machines in this availability set. And then what Azure then knows is that those machines are doing the same function, they're doing the same job, and they need to be distributed across our data centers. So different fault domains, so think a little bit like power and networking, for example, or different update domains, so a different underlying host. And that way, what you know is if you bring your application down, or we do our duty as Microsoft to go and update the underlying fleet, then that tier is not going to be brought down there.
Yeah. An important thing here, again, is that you've got to make this choice. It isn't a case of you deploy a virtual machine and Azure creates others for you to meet that resilience. You've got to deploy them. You need to specify the availability set, the configuration there, and then we'll manage what you've put in. So it isn't magical in that sense. You still have to deploy them.
But I mean, it's not a hard task either because it makes it easy to do. It is just one of those setup pieces you do need to think about. Now, on the other side of the screen, we've got availability zones. And this is kind of the approach where rather than you think about just a data center, so inside the data center building, you're thinking across data centers. So if you think about maybe a bronze, silver, gold approach, where bronze is maybe inside of the data center, you're across those different racks of machines potentially. In that kind of silver approach, you're across the different zones or different data centers of a region. And then gold might be multiple regions, for example. And again, you know, this concept is really coming down to what are your requirements? Do you even need to go and do that? Because
how available?
Exactly. There may be complexities that come with that. There may be some cost elements that come with that as well. And it's always worth thinking about that all overarching picture there.
What risks are you trying to mitigate in the design? Makes sense.
Exactly. So that's the infrastructure side of things, and you know that makes sense. And some of these concepts translate to PaaS, some of them don't. So it really does depend on which platform as a service option you choose. If we think about things like functions, you know, functions is a great option. But what happens if there was some problem in a particular region? You know, maybe there was a natural disaster. You know, these things can happen. So it comes back to what is the appetite of risk from the business perspective. And that's where then you need to think about implementing your own resilience. You know, if you picked Azure Functions, for example, you could have a function app in one region, function app in another region, and then traffic manager in the front to go and route between the two.
Yes.
And that would be, again, quite an elegant approach to resilience.
Yeah.
But it's something that it doesn't come out of the box, and it's something that you need to consider and be aware of for each of those different platform as a service options.
So we're starting to get into that realm of partly the difference between high availability and disaster recovery and where the overlap is. Because as your resilience needs increase, you start to have a mix between the two there.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it makes perfect sense. So there you go. Azure can be magical. You still need to make decisions yourself. You still need to work out what your requirements are and do a correct design, and Azure will implement that for you.